and welcome all of you to this public lecture series on pathways and paradigms of India's G20 presidency. I am your host Samina Hamid and I am joined by Professor Sangeeta Bansal, an eminent environmental economist, to tell us about the role of G20 in addressing climate change. Professor Sangeeta Bansal is the chairperson at Center for International Trade and Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her expertise lies in the domains of environmental economics, climate change, energy economics, new agriculture technology, and nutrition. Her more than 70 peer-reviewed publications have been widely cited. She is the editor of the journal Agricultural Economics, the flagship journal of the International Association of Agricultural Economics, co-editor of the journal Resource and Energy Economics, and member of the editorial boards of several other prestigious journals on the domain. She was awarded fellowship to visit Zurich as a visiting scientist early last year. She was also the recipient of Fulbright Nehru Senior Research Fellowship. She is a founding member of the International Committee of Women in Agriculture Economics. She has served as a member of a scientific panel of Food Safety and Standards Authority of India. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sangeeta Bansal.
Oh, thank you very much.
The climate change is hardly a matter of debate anymore. What needs to be discussed is how to respond to it. The world has witnessed a flurry of catastrophic climatic disasters of unprecedented scale. The recent wildfires in Hawaii, in Mediterranean regions, the storms and landslides in the Pacific coast and all over the world are ready pointers of the imminent dangers that we are facing. And yet it's so difficult and complex to save our planet. I will ask Professor Sangeeta Bansal to decode the complexity of addressing climate change and the role of G20. Professor.
Thank you, Samina, for your kind words, and very challenging thing to decode climate change. But thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on the topic that I'm going to talk about today. That's climate change and role of G20 in addressing it. So, as all of us know that accumulation of greenhouse gases in atmosphere has been taking place at a very fast pace in the past 50 years, and it far exceeds the absorptive capacity of our global ecosystem. And what happens is, when this accumulation gets too high, like of gases, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, etc., it starts affecting climate around us. In the 6th assessment report of IPCC, it has been observed that the climate systems around us, they have been demonstrably changed as compared to pre-industrial revolution times, both at the regional level as well as at the global level. And how does climate change manifest itself? I mean, how do we even get to know what is climate change and it's happening? So, the two major indicators of climate change, one is rise in temperatures. It has been recorded, IPCC has recorded that over the 20th century, global surface temperatures increased by 1.1 degrees centigrade. And the other manifestation is in terms of changing rainfall patterns and precipitation patterns. And that also we have experienced, that's happening. Rainfalls have become very uncertain. Even in Delhi, one doesn't know when it's going to rain, and over the years one sees changing rainfall patterns. And all these changes, they have an effect on human beings, and as I'll talk about various kind of effects that we may suffer because of climate change. So, one thing which we are already experiencing, and Samana also mentioned it, that we are experiencing extreme weather events. And what does climate change does? It increases the severity of these events, the frequency of these events, and duration of these events. We all are aware of cyclones, hurricanes, and devastating floods. It was very devastating for Pakistan, even India, Uttarakhand, we experienced floods. There have been forest fires all around the world. And how does forest fire related to climate change? When weather becomes drier and temperatures increase, then risk of forest fire increases. So recently in Greece, California, Canada, Turkey, so many countries, they are experiencing forest fires. Large land masses, they are suffering from desertification, and because of changing rainfall patterns, we are also experiencing droughts. Now, all these things, they will cause human suffering. They will affect welfare of human beings in several ways. So, first let us talk about agricultural sector. Academic world, and the most it has been documented that climate change puts stress on agricultural sector. It reduces crop yields, it reduces production of fisheries, marine products, and even livestock production, because temperatures are rising and rainfall patterns are changing. According to some estimates, the global agricultural yield will decrease by 30% due to climate change by 2050. And now you can imagine the kind of impact it would have on food security. Global food stock availability will reduce, and who's going to suffer more? Obviously developing countries who are already struggling with malnutrition, starvation, and undernutrition. They are the ones who will be even more stressed because of changing or reduction in food production. The other major impact of climate change is it's going to be on water. As we know that 2/3 of the fresh water that's available, that's frozen in glaciers. As temperatures rise, there is likelihood of glaciers to melt, and when glaciers melt, initially there will be floods, but later on there will be water scarcity. And water is required, of course, for drinking, that's like an essential thing. But other than that, it also has use in agriculture as well as the industrial sector. So, already, according to United Nations, more than 2 billion people worldwide don't have access to safe drinking water. And one can imagine when this stress becomes even more severe and more people do not have access to drinking water, again the effects are going to be different in different parts of the world, like parts of Africa, West Asia and Central Asia, they are particularly likely to be more affected by water scarcity. And now all these, when I talk about food and water, these effects are not independent of each other, they are interrelated, because water scarcity will also change food production and it will exacerbate the food security effect of climate change. There are so many other impacts that have also been documented, like loss of biodiversity. What would loss of biodiversity does? It will reduce the resilience of ecosystems to any extreme weather events. So, we will be less capable of coping up with extreme events. We know that heat strokes, they take so many lives, and there will be increased spread of diseases. Many coastal cities, they have risk of being submerged, and climate change is also related to air pollution. It has been related to reducing student performance. So, now there are these studies which say that because when it becomes too hot, many students are not able to go to school, or schools are shut down for certain periods. That affects student performance. It also affects labor productivity. All those workers who have to work in the open fields, their productivity gets affected. So, obviously, it is affecting the economy, it is affecting well-being of human beings, and all this causes suffering for us. Okay. So, just to think about when we say climate change and suffering related to it, how does it relate to sustainable development goals? Because G20 has also been talking about sustainable development goals. And I started jotting down, and it seems that all these 17 sustainable goals are somewhere or other related to climate change. Poverty, if people lose their livelihoods, obviously poverty is going to increase. Food security will affect hunger, diseases and food security, that is going to affect health, and women are particularly more adversely affected by climate change. Clean water and sanitation. Energy is a very important part of this whole debate around climate change, and I will be spending substantial time on energy. Then of course, sustainable cities and communities, and responsible consumption and production, and of course, goal 13, climate action, is directly related to climate change. So, when we are talking about climate change, it's not, we are just not talking about climate change and its associated effects, we are also talking about how this is going to make achieving sustainable development goals even more difficult. Okay. So, one would think about that, okay, climate change is happening, it is happening because of nature, what do human beings have to do about it, why should we think about what are the steps that we can take. But climate change and this rise in global greenhouse gas emissions is closely related to economic growth and unsustainable growth paths that many countries have taken. What do I mean by unsustainable growth paths? That there is industrialization accompanied by urbanization, so which leads to land use change. Large parts of land is deforested and changed into urban areas. And one of the major contributors to climate change is fossil fuel based energy systems, because as I will show you that it is the energy or carbon combustion which leads to carbon emissions. And another important factor where I will be spending some time on is also lifestyles and patterns of consumption. How consumptions are changing as we adopt more and more westernized lifestyles, our total carbon footprint is also going to increase. Okay. So, first of all, before we go to even addressing what is climate change and all that, we first want to understand the nature of climate change. It is actually a global public good, in the sense that it does not matter who is emitting these greenhouse gases. They all mix uniformly in the atmosphere, and that concentration is going to affect everybody. So, in that sense it is a public good, and therefore, it requires a coordinated action. Although its impact might differ across regions and countries, different countries differ in terms of their vulnerabilities towards climate change, and emerging nations, poor nations, they are obviously more vulnerable. First of all, because of their locations, they are lying in areas where temperatures are going to increase and that might become too high to bear. Second very important factor is that these countries also lack resources for adaptation measures to climate change. So, like once I was attending some seminar in US, and they presented a paper and they said that, okay, India, if they are suffering from climate change, install ACs everywhere. That requires resources, and that will also have an effect, because more ACs will also mean more carbon emissions, right. So, we do not have resources to adapt to rising temperatures or to protect ourselves from rainfall, variations in rainfall, right. So, it is not as easy as in some of the developed countries. Most of the residential buildings, they are insulated, they are heated or air conditioned. So, they do not have to really suffer from these effects on a daily basis as much as a developing country would have to suffer. So, with all this, there is a growing consensus amongst nations that there is a need to mitigate global greenhouse gas emissions. Mitigation is desirable. but the contentious issue is how to share this responsibility, who is going to mitigate, and then different countries, they come up with different solutions and suggestions, and there have been international meetings one after another, and still we haven't been able to come to a consensus as to how this responsibility should be shared. Okay. So, to understand what needs to be done, we also need to look at the sectoral contribution of carbon emissions, and generation of electricity and heat, that is the largest contributor worldwide. So, about 40% of total carbon emissions, they come in form of generation of electricity. So, if somehow we could move to something other than fossil fuel based electricity generation, then we will be able to address this problem or reduce carbon emissions. And this is happening because at the moment this sector heavily depends upon coal, which is very carbon intensive fossil fuel. Transport is the second largest sector contributing to carbon emissions, and at least in the west, residential sector, buildings, they are the third largest sector, and industry also contributes substantially to carbon emissions. So, that understanding gives us targets, what should we be targeting if we want to reduce carbon emissions. Okay. Addressing climate change is a complex issue. It's not something very simple, otherwise there have been so many global meetings and international conventions, they would have figured out. And it's complex because we don't have a global government which can direct countries to do this or that. Whatever comes out, it has to be through a consensus, or in our jargon we also call it self-enforcing agreements, that we agree to do something, because nobody has a power over sovereign nations to tell them that you can't grow, you have to cut down your carbon emissions. That's not what's going to work. And there are political economy issues. Whatever countries commit at the international meetings, they should be able to implement it domestically. They still want to be in power, so they can't say that we'll do it, we'll address climate change over economic growth of our country. That's not going to work political economy. And there are these intertemporal aspects. Whatever costs we have to incur in reducing carbon emissions, those costs are incurred today, but the benefits will accrue to future generations. So, how do you compare these costs which will have to be incurred today and benefits will be enjoyed by future generations? So, do politicians today would want to incur these costs, because tomorrow or 5 years from now, 10 years from now, one does not know which political party will be in power, right. So, there are all these issues, and therefore, there is no simple path towards addressing climate change. Okay. So, various notions that are talked about in international meetings is that who has the historical responsibility. Obviously, industrialized countries, they emitted large majority of greenhouse gases. They are responsible for about 80% of total cumulative emissions. US alone accounts for 20% of total emissions. So, historically, the responsibility lies with the West. But, and that is an important but, emerging economies are also now contributing large amount of carbon emissions, because they are on their economic and demographic growth path, and obviously their share is also increasing. So, the various debates around how this responsibility should be shared, the Kyoto coined the term shared but differentiated responsibility. So, how are we going to share it? Obviously, developing countries, they are demanding that the right to emissions should be on the basis of population, per capita population, because their per capita emissions are very less. Somebody would argue that it should be on the basis of land area. Larger countries should be allowed to do more emissions. West would talk about grandfathering or historical, the share of emissions. They have been doing it and they would want to continue doing those emissions. And somebody would say that emissions allowed should be in proportion to GDP. Now, obviously, there are very, these are old notions of fairness. What is fair distribution of carbon emissions? And that fairness notion can be very subjective. Who's proposing would have a different notion of fairness in mind. And unless, we can bridge those gaps, come closer to some agreement, we can continue arguing and adequate action and steps won't be taken. Okay. So, this is a snapshot and from some presentation of various global initiatives and agreements that have taken place related to carbon. I just want to talk about Paris Agreement. So, first major global international agreement was on Kyoto, but with Paris Agreement there was a change, because this was like a bottoms up kind of an approach, where countries themselves will determine their targets nationally. These are called nationally determined contributions, and they, rather than imposing it from the top, countries themselves will say that this is what we are going to do, and then they go back and domestically they find ways of doing it, and they try to target of limiting temperature rise to 2 degrees centigrade. And then another important one was Glasgow Conference of Parties 26, which concluded in November 2021, and here many countries, they committed to net zero emissions by a certain date. So, EU and US, they committed to net zero emissions by 2050, and China by 2060. India was also very ambitious and has committed to net zero emissions by 2017. There was also an agreement that there will be effort to phase down coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So, these are some positive actions that have been taken place, and at least countries have gone ahead and committed to net zero emissions, which I still feel is very ambitious. Okay. So, an important issue related to all this would be that where would resources come from? If you want to achieve net zero carbon emissions, then we will have to take many domestic actions. These actions will require resources, because maybe some cleaner technologies have to be adopted. You have to change your energy systems from fossil fuel based systems to maybe renewable based or electric based, which requires large infrastructural investments. So, climate finance itself is an important issue, and not only to mitigate climate change, but also to adapt to adverse effects of climate change. Some kind of finance will be required. In Copenhagen 2009, there was a commitment made that by 2020, developed countries would begin to contribute 100 billion per year to developing countries to help finance greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation to climate change. Though there was a commitment, but obviously that kind of funding hasn't come as yet. There has been some funding in the climate fund, but it's still very far from an amount which will be able to address climate change. So, I mean, this is just some figure which shows geographical distribution of private finance for climate. And the countries which benefited are Africa, Asia, and some Latin American countries. Some part also went to Europe, and the major donor countries include United Nations, United States, France, UK, Germany, and Sweden. Okay. So, all this discussion brings to 3 key pathways for addressing climate change. One, there needs to be transition to clean energy system. As I said that the major contribution is coming from fossil fuel based energy. So, somehow we have to figure out how to move towards clean energy systems, but again this transition will require resources. So, if really one has to do something to address climate change, one has to find resources to be able to do it. And third and very important point here is also about individual responsibility. Somehow in the discourse it's felt like as if it's the responsibility of the governments to do something, whereas as individuals we can do a lot to reduce carbon footprint. If everybody does at least few things to cut down their consumption or emissions or some environmental friendly behavior, that can make a huge difference. And this individual responsibility is something which India also conceptualized and talked about, and I will be coming to that. Okay. So, why G20, why we are talking about G20? Since addressing climate change requires coordinated action and effort across countries and regions, G20 is a powerful group which can play an important role in bringing about consensus towards climate action plan. Initially, it was founded as an international economic cooperation, forum for international economic cooperation, but gradually in view of threat of climate change, it expanded its agenda to include other dimensions of development. So, there is one dimension of development which is purely economic, but there are other dimensions of development which is environmental dimension and social dimension. So, G20 in its agenda items it included these dimensions, and if you read all these declarations and you will find agenda items including sustainable development, inclusive growth, health for everybody, agriculture, energy, environment and climate change. So, all these things have now become an agenda item for G20, and so it's like G20 group is also realizing the importance of addressing climate change and bringing it in its agenda items. So, right since beginning, since 2009, energy was discussed and was included as a critical element for sustainable global economy. And since 2015 onwards, climate agreements, climate change, these have also become important agenda items in G20 annual meetings. And in 2016, the action plan for 2030 agenda for sustainable development was also adopted. So, explicitly sustainable development, green growth, climate change, these are agenda items for G20 countries. And just to look at some macro variables that how powerful this G20 group is. So, in terms of total world's output, G20 countries account for 70% of GDP. So, out of the total world's output, these 19 countries and 1 EU, they account for 70% of total output that is produced in the world, about 40% of population, and 3/4, 72% of global carbon emissions. So, if some steps can be taken within this group, that will make a huge difference, because they are the ones who are contributing 3/4 of carbon emissions. And that is why it is important to take this as an agenda item within G20 group. Okay. Even if we look at top emitters of carbon, we find China contributes to around 27% of total carbon emissions, and then US is another major contributor, but India is also not far behind. It is the third largest contributor of carbon to global carbon emissions. Okay. So, that means that some responsibility also lies with India, and that is happening because we are on our growth path. and we need to grow, it's not saying that we should stop growing, but we need to think that are there ways to grow responsibly, and can we maintain our growth path without increasing carbon footprint. Well, I mean, if I present to you total contributions of carbon, I should also talk about per capita emissions. India being a densely populated country, its per capita emissions are much lower than world average and much lower than some of the other countries. So, although in terms of total carbon emissions we are third largest, but that is also happening because we are also the second largest in terms of population. But in terms of per capita carbon space that India is occupying, it is still very less, and that does not seem to be a scope for reducing per capita emissions much below what we already have. Okay. So, I talked about individual responsibility, and let me spend some time on individual responsibility, and especially since this was an initiative and a concept introduced by India in COP26, lifestyle for environment. This acknowledges that consumer behavior and how we consume, that has a big impact on environment and society. Realizing it, acknowledging it also encourages us adoption of sustainable lifestyles and promotion of pro-environmental behavior. So, when Prime Minister Modi introduced it at COP26, it aimed to create a global network of responsible citizens called pro-planet people, and the aim was that this will create some kind of a social norm of acting responsibly. We can't leave everything to the government, that government is going to do it, but we are going to consume the way we want to. We keep generating waste, and we keep consuming energy irresponsibly. Okay. So, the same notion is also echoed in the theme of G20 dialogue this year, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, and this one earth, one family is like we should respect our planet as we respect our family. We should take care of planet as we take care of our family. And India already has this rich cultural history of sustainable traditions, respect for nature, not to generate waste, etc. And we want to popularize these notions to the world. We want to make the world aware of these notions and see what impact will it have. So, what do I even mean by sustainable consumption? What can be the various examples of sustainable consumption? Reducing energy and water consumption, we can begin from there. Not to waste energy, try to use energy efficient appliances in our homes, shift to renewable energy sources wherever possible, and improve efficiency in the use of energy, choosing environmentally friendly products, and very important thing is waste management. That's done at an individual level. How much waste we are generating and how we are disposing it. To this, now there's another concept, circular economy, but it all starts from an individual responsibility, that how much waste are we generating, can we reduce that waste, packaging waste or food waste, any kind of waste, and are we disposing all our waste in a responsible manner, is it safe disposal. So, that is like individual responsibility, supporting local and sustainable food systems. These changing consumption patterns, they require concerted efforts from people, companies, governments, some kind of a behavioral nudges, and now the literature is looking into what kind of behavioral nudges can be given so that people start acting responsibility. It could be labels. So, we know that Bureau of Energy Efficiency has introduced energy efficient labels. So, if I want to buy an AC or a refrigerator or anything, the label will be on the product, and I can make an informed decision, what product do I want to buy. Okay. Along with sustainable consumption, also sustainable production is important. How companies are they acting responsibly? We know that all production process will produce large amounts of waste. How is this waste disposed of? Is it treated or simply dumped into rivers, dumped into landfills? What's happening? Are they using cleaner inputs? What kind of technologies they are using? Are they using cleaner technologies, cleaner inputs, and what is their energy consumption levels? Are they using some mix of renewable and fossil fuel based energy, and also they can use energy efficient green buildings. Another very important factor which will bring about lowering carbon emissions is low carbon transportation systems. So, these are many ways in which we can think about reducing carbon generation. Okay. So, being economists, we can't help but look at some data. So, I looked at data and see that everybody is saying that there is a correlation between GDP and carbon emissions. So, are there countries which are at the same GDP level, but their per capita carbon emissions are very different? And if you just look at this figure, you can see that the names are not very clear, but one can see that even GDP levels of China and Saudi Arabia, they are similar, but there is a huge difference in their per capita emissions. Similarly, there are many of these countries which lie along the same GDP per capita. You can see difference between European Union and Kuwait and Canada and United States. They are much higher in terms of per capita emissions. So, that motivated us to think that maybe lifestyle patterns had something to do with carbon emissions. Even if we have more GDP, it is possible that we are able to reduce our carbon emissions. And to do that exercise, it is a little econometric exercise, just some capturing some kind of correlations. So, we have per capita carbon emissions as our dependent variable, and we regress it on a couple of independent variables. First of all, per capita GDP, so that even if we control for per capita GDP, are there other things which matter in terms of carbon emissions. So, to capture lifestyle changes, we include degree of urbanization, and to capture how many electrical appliances and things people own, use mobile cellular subscriptions. So, that is kind of a proxy for all kind of electronic gadgets that one may have. And for food, we dietary patterns, we took livestock production index, because plant based food has lower carbon footprint as compared to animal based food products. And also a very important factor was per capita waste generation. And if you look at data, there is this huge gap in per capita waste generation. The waste that we generate here in India and the waste that one of these western economies they generate per capita, there is a huge difference. So, we run this regression and we just take data from World Bank for year 2020 and we find some interesting results. So, I like to of course, carbon emissions they are increasing in per capita GDP, that is like understandable, that is reasonable, but we also find that even after controlling for per capita GDP, carbon emissions are increasing in the gadgets that people are using and also per capita waste emissions. And I think these are the things where one can think about what kind of a growth path do we want. We are still an emerging economy and we still have to grow, but there seems to be some scope where we can grow at a path where our carbon emissions do not increase as much as all these developed countries have. The kind of growth path they have taken, we do not necessarily need to follow the same growth path, and we can be more responsible in terms of waste generation, we can be more responsible in terms of energy consumption. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think I should be kind of try to close it. So, in terms of pathways and paradigms, which is like the theme of this lecture series, emerging economies are on their economic and demographic growth path, and with economic growth, energy consumption is likely to increase. So, we are not even suggesting that energy consumption should be increasing. It's likely that population will be using more electronics, appliances, gadgets, air travel, and more cars, more per capita meat consumption, and a move towards processed foods. All that will be accompanied by the growth process. However, these economies still have a chance to think about what kind of a growth path we want to take. How can we move on a responsible and sustainable economic growth path which minimizes carbon footprint? So, the world is looking at G20 to build more resilient, equitable and sustainable global system and to address global challenges such as climate change. What it requires? It would require economies to transition towards cleaner energy systems, to strive for energy efficiency. India has also adopted many policies for energy efficiency. To ensure that our transportation system is low carbon, which will mean that more provision of public transportation system, which is convenient, so that people do not have to take their own private vehicles on road, and also promoting renewable energies. Again, I will emphasize what I have been talking about earlier also, responsible consumption and production. That has to be part of our narrative or about growth story, reduce waste, and for many of these things finances and resources will be required. So, there is a need to arrange for funds to address climate change, and there is also need for transfer of clean technologies. And since G20 group itself comprises of developed as well as developing nations, this cooperation and coordination can happen within G20 group. European countries, they have access to much cleaner technologies. They do not have to grapple with air pollution problems, whereas developing countries have to suffer from air pollution. All of us staying in Delhi know what is air pollution and how it is affecting us. So, there is a lot of scope for this kind of cooperation within the G20 group, and somehow in economics we believe that things will happen when there is an incentive to do so. So, some kind of give and take has to be figured out where both parties have an incentive to agree to that agreement. Otherwise, things will be on paper and it does not get implemented. Okay, so there are some challenges, and the biggest challenge is that how do we reduce carbon emissions while trying to still achieve economic growth. There is a clear trade off, right. At one hand you want to give access to energy to your population, at least basic electricity, etc. You want to give them access, to affordable, reliable, clean energy, but you also do not want carbon emissions to go up. And that is a challenge which needs to be figured out, and this is like one slide which I like to show at most presentations. So, if you look at access to electricity until 2001, I have this for about 600 million people in India didn't have access to electricity, which is like a basic necessity, and no kind of climate policy will say that you don't give access to electricity to your population. This has improved considerably over the years. By 2019, population has access to electricity. Reliability and other things, we still not sure how much is the power outage, or if even if there is a grid in one village, all households are connected to it or not. I don't have data for that. Okay. But if I look at clean fuel, even till 1920, large population does not have access to clean cooking fuel. So, so these are challenges. One, we talk about climate change, and addressing climate change means that we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we reduce carbon emissions, but it is very important to ensure that our population gets access to basic necessities like clean cooking fuel and electricity, etc. And that becomes a challenge for any emerging economy. Okay. Do I have time? 2-3 minutes? Okay. So, so when I think about that, we have to achieve economic growth and also reduce carbon emissions. That means somehow the ratio CO2 by GDP, which is carbon intensity of growth, that should come down. If that comes down, you can still increase the denominator and reduce the numerator. And fortunately, that has been continuously improving in the Indian economy. Our carbon emissions per unit of GDP have reduced by more than 20% between 1990 and 2008, and India aims to further reduce these emission intensity by 20 to 25% more. However, carbon intensity of energy has been rising. So, so we can just decode it in that sense that what needs to be done. We need to pay attention to what is happening to carbon intensity of our energy generation. So, I will just wind up with some commitments that India has made towards climate change. It has committed to reduce emission intensity of GDP by 30 to 35%. It has also committed to increasing cumulative electricity generation from fossil free energy to about 40% by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2070. Well, as I said earlier, these are ambitious goals, and we would like to see domestic action which corresponds and which makes sure that we are able to reach these goals within the stipulated time period. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Bansal. You have very forcefully brought home the point that we in emerging economies have a long way to go, and that gives us an opportunity that we can do it in a way which is sustainable and we can make a difference. Your lectures have illuminated various pathways to address climate change, and I'm sure it has kindled a few questions. So let us invite a few questions from the participants in this room. Yes, please identify yourself and pose your question.
I'm a master's student and of international relations and area studies, and my question is regarding climate-induced migration and displacement. And we know that G20 countries receive some of the highest footfalls of such migration. But this year's 2023 G20 Environment and Climate Ministers meeting has failed to achieve any consensus. So, what is the way forward for G20 in this context? Thank you.
Yeah, so as I've been saying that these are all very difficult issues to address. So when I talk about there will be submergence of coastal cities, there's loss of livelihoods and fires, obviously there will be migration related to it. But what countries can do, that's a huge question, and migration doesn't happen just for climate reasons. Migration happens due to conflict, and countries are already grappling with so many of migration issues, and this becomes an added migration, an added problem to address. So there's no simple answer that there are these people who are migratory and we can just resettle them.
Eco-labeling in Europe, particularly in Germany, eco-labeling such as blue angels ensure the environment-friendly character of the product through the life cycle of the product, right from the consumption till the disposal stage. That also include the plastic waste. So, if they have been able to keep their water body healthy, so what are the ways in which they have gone about it? Is it means, would this be efficacious in case of India, a developing country, to sensitize people just uh, by simply offering consumer choices? Uh, I think that rather than simply offering the consumer choices, the eco labeling right at the production stage of the products, mandatory enforcement of the eco labeling at the production stage could be more efficacious in ensuring that plastic wastes do not find their way to water bodies. So uh, I think that is the way in which the European countries have been able to keep their environment healthy.
Thank you for your question. I myself have worked a lot on eco labels. So, the reason why eco labels are successful in Western economies is because there are consumers who are willing to pay more for such labels, and companies are responding to that kind of a consumer demand. In developing countries, just because we don't have enough resources, we haven't seen that kind of demand coming from consumers. And if there is no demand for consumers, obviously firms are not going to spend extra resources in providing those labels. And when you say that it should be made mandatory, well, you know, I've looked at a lot on mandatory versus voluntary labeling. When should we make anything mandatory labeling? We should make anything mandatory labeling when it has some kind of health or safety hazards associated with it. If it's just consumer choice, then it doesn't make sense to make it mandatorily, eco labeling, because it's not like large populations, they're willing to pay more just because this product is environment friendly. There could be some people who want to pay that extra price, and market should respond to them. So this is like a question very pertinent in economics, that when would labeling be successful, and it seems that in the West labeling is successful because of many reasons. One, the market forces, there are consumers who demand it. Second, also there is this threat from government of imposing stringent regulations. Somehow environmental regulations are not implemented very stringently in developing countries. So all these forces end up that in the market you don't find many products which are labeled as environment friendly, although in India there is a huge market for organic products. So that's something where market responds, and it's growing at a very fast pace. And if you go to any of these fancy stores, and they're very expensive. So organic is also environmentally friendly in the sense that there's no use of pesticides and chemicals and fertilizers. There's a market for it because there's also a kind of health benefit associated with organic products. But how much Indian consumers are willing to pay more for something which is simply environment friendly but doesn't have any health benefit associated with it, we don't have data to study that.
G20 climate change are focused on energy transition. In India's G20 presidency allowed it the opportunity to direct the focus on climate financing and technology transfers. And additionally, can India utilize the Business 20 track to attract investment into renewable technologies, especially for developing countries?
Yeah. So, as I said that we economists believe that economic incentives are important. Coal is abundantly available in India. It's a cheaper raw material, and there are also many vested interests. So it doesn't seem that we'll phase out coal. And India also made its position clear when I talked about COP26. There was talk about phasing out coal. So India said, we're not just phasing it out; it deferred it. But at the same time, there are initiatives taken to promote electric vehicles in India. So huge infrastructural investment is also taking place for solar energy, and the cost of solar energy per unit has come down. So we may not be able to phase out coal, but we can develop alternative energy sources, cleaner energy sources like solar energy, and also more use of electric vehicles. So that will bring down carbon footprint of transportation sector.
Thank you, ma'am. It was brilliant.